Welcome to this video message about human sacrifice in relation to Moses. Now Moses, who did many things, gave the law. So he provided God's law, which demonstrates God's righteousness and articulates God's righteousness. Now, included with the law and its provisions was the provision for the death penalty for certain offences, such as murder and kidnapping. And you might say, well, is that a form of human sacrifice? You have to ask, what is the alternative? Do we allow a murderer to go free so that there's the possibility of repeat offending? We have to ask also, what other sanctions are available in a primitive culture? In primitive cultures, there was no imprisonment. That's an economic burden and just a feature that was not present in very early societies. A prisoner might be held in custody until their trial, but the notion of lifetime custody was not present. Other sanctions included restitution, where if you stole a sheep, you'd give back the sheep, or maybe give back 4 sheep, more like, which would be a deterrent as well. Banishment would be another sanction in certain early cultures, or confiscation of property. So you have to ask, what is the alternative to the death penalty in a primitive society for offences like murder and kidnapping? And in addition to a punishment and a preservation for society so that a murderer would not be on the loose to continue offending, there's also the issue of a deterrent, that a punishment, and capital punishment of course, is a strong deterrent to others who would choose to offend in the same way. And even the law, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which often gets bad press, knowing that that is a sanction really causes you to concentrate when you're about to punish someone else. You're about to punch someone in the eye and you realize, I'm going to be punched in the eye if I do this. So it's like punching myself in the eye. And so it's a wonderful deterrent. And in fact, I can't think of any case in the Old Testament where this was actually applied. It was provided as a deterrent and was an effective deterrent. And of course, the better approach is that if you're going to punch someone in the eye, you think you have compassion for that person. You say, I don't want to hurt that person because I know what pain feels like. But if you're a selfish person who only wants to preserve your own comfort, then the law is a deterrent. And indeed, that's the purpose of the law. Someone who loves doing what's right doesn't need the law because they will make good choices in their relationships with other people. Now, when we go on to tribal issues, it expands this topic. Certain tribes would have been fought against in tribal warfare and put to death by other tribes. And so in relation to the Old Testament narrative, and when the people of God came in to possess the land and went to war against these tribes, just to point out a few things, these tribes were not put to death for their ethnicity. They were put to death for their behavior. A civilization had arisen which, among other things, practiced child sacrifice. So you have a culture and a society which has institutionalized murder, and then you have a competing tribe that vies with that tribe for the land. So again, you have to ask, what is the alternative? Let's say you're faced with 2 tribes who are, warring for possession of a land so that they can multiply and establish a civilization. And one tribe practices child sacrifice. The other tribe has a law which says that child sacrifice is absolutely forbidden. I think if you are making the choice, you would say you would prefer to see the more humane tribe taking possession of the land and multiplying and establishing a civilization, rather than the perpetuation of a civilization which institutionalizes murder. But now that's not your call to make, and that's not my call to make. We have to recognize that these kind of decisions are above your pay grade and mine, and indeed above the pay grade of any human. But we're talking about God's call in terms of which tribe would possess the land at that time. This is, we have to remember, God's universe, and we live by his gift, and our lives are sustained by his provision of air and food. It's all God's gift to us, all God's provision. And if we continue to violate God's laws and God's righteousness, that is not sustainable. It is not reasonable that we can continue living endlessly in God's world, consuming God's resources in order to establish civilization which is opposed to God's righteousness and God's law, a murderous civilization, or a civilization which in other ways is anathema to the righteousness of God. And so this gives us some additional perspective on the narrative around the conquest of Canaan that we find in the Old Testament. And there's a personal challenge for us in considering this. Whenever we consider law, there's a personal challenge to become a lover of righteousness. Don't be someone who has to be made do the right thing by punishment, by deterrent, by negative consequences. But rather, let's choose to be people who will do what's right because we delight to do what's right. And of course, that is what the law is meant to nudge a person towards. It's a certain amount of external discipline for a time until we would grow up and learn that doing the right thing brings joy to others, brings joy to ourselves, and is the best choice. So thank you for joining us on this message.